Daniel Harris walked through the crystalline halls of the Valorian Palace and felt small, which was exactly what the architecture intended him to feel. The ceilings rose 40 feet above his head, carved from pale blue stone that seemed to glow from within, and the pillars that lined every corridor were thick enough to hide a shuttle behind them. Everything on Valoria Prime was built for beings who stood 8 feet tall and lived for thousands of years. And Daniel was neither of those things. He was just a human, barely 6 feet tall, with a lifespan that the Valorians considered tragically brief. And he had been living in this palace for 6 months as the cultural attached to the first human diplomatic mission. It was not a glamorous job. Ambassador Laura Bennett handled the important meetings, the trade negotiations, the careful political dances that might one day lead to a formal alliance between humanity and the ancient Valorian Empire. Daniel's job was simpler and, most days, completely ignored. He answered questions about human culture when anyone bothered to ask, and he studied Valorian customs so that the ambassador would not accidentally offend anyone important. So far, almost no one had bothered to ask him anything. The Valorians were a proud species, elegant and cold and absolutely certain of their superiority over younger races. Like humanity, they had built starships when humans were still learning to make fire, and they had mapped galaxies while humans were fighting wars with swords and arrows to them. Humanity was a curiosity at best and a nuisance at worst, a loud and emotional species that had somehow stumbled into space. Travel without earning the right to be there. Daniel had learned to accept the polite dismissals and the barely hidden contempt. He smiled at guards who never smiled back. He bowed to nobles who looked through him as if he did not exist. And he spent most of his evenings alone because no one wanted to share a meal with the human. Tonight was like every other night. After a dinner eaten alone in his small quarters, Daniel made his way to the palace gardens, a vast enclosed space filled with plants from 100 different worlds. He had discovered this place in his first week on Valoria, and it had become his refuge from the loneliness that pressed in on him everywhere else. He found his usual bench beneath a tree with silver leaves that chimed softly in the artificial breeze, and he pulled out a worn paperback book from his jacket pocket. It was an old habit, reading aloud to himself. His mother had read to him every night as a child. And even now, far from Earth and surrounded by aliens who thought him primitive, the sound of his own voice speaking familiar words brought him comfort. Tonight, he was reading poetry, ancient verses about love and loss and the stubborn human refusal to surrender to despair. He did not know that someone was listening. Princess Alindra Velshan stood in the shadows behind a flowering hedge, just as she had stood there every night for the past 3 weeks. She was the third daughter of the Valorian Emperor, young by her species standards at only 200 years old, and she had spent most of her life being told that curiosity was unbecoming in a royal. But Alindra had never been good at following rules. She had first noticed the human by accident, wandering the gardens late one night when sleep would not come, and she had heard his voice drifting through the leaves like something from a dream. At first, she had been confused by what she heard, unable to understand why anyone would speak words aloud when there was no one to hear them. Then she had been fascinated. The humans spoke of things that made no sense to her, concepts that had no equivalent in the Valorian language, emotions that her people had either never known or had long ago forgotten. She returned the next night, and the next, and the next after that. Now she found herself counting the hours until evening came, and she could slip away to listen to the strange little human with his strange little books. She knew it was improper. A princess hiding in bush to eavesdrop on a primitive alien. But she could not stop herself. There was something in his voice that called to her, something hungry and sad and beautiful all at once. And she wanted to understand what it was. Back in the main palace, Ambassador Bennett was dealing with problems far more serious than poetry. She stood in her office reviewing reports that made her stomach tight with worry. Reports about the Galactic Concordance and their increasing pressure on Valoria to reject the human alliance. The Concordance was a coalition of older species who viewed humanity with suspicion and fear, and they had been lobbying the Valorian Emperor for months to send the human delegation away. So far, the Emperor had remained neutral, neither welcoming the humans nor rejecting them. But Bennett knew that neutrality would not last forever. She needed something to tip the balance, some way to prove that humanity was worth the risk of angering the Concordance. But so far, nothing had worked. The Valorians simply did not care about humans. They were too old, too certain, too convinced that nothing new could surprise them after 10,000 years of civilization. Bennett sighed and rubbed her tired eyes, wondering if this mission was doomed to failing the gardens. Daniel closed his book and sat for a moment in the silence. The silver leaves chimed above him, and somewhere in the distance a night bird sang. And he felt the familiar ache of missing home. He missed Earth's blue sky and green grass. He missed coffee and pizza and baseball games on summer evenings. He missed being around people who did not look at him like he was an insect that had wandered into their palace by mistake. But he was here for a reason, and he would not give up. He stood and stretched and began walking back to his quarters, never noticing the princess who watched him go with questions burning in her ancient eyes. He was almost to his door when a palace servant appeared in front of him. A tall Valorian woman with lavender skin and an expression of barely controlled shock. She held out a small crystal tablet, the kind used for formal messages in the Valorian court. Daniel took it with confusion, wondering who would possibly be sending him a formal message. The words that appeared on the crystal made his heart stop. Princess Alindra Velshan requests your presence in her private chambers this evening, at the hour of the third moon. The servant was staring at him with wide eyes, clearly just as stunned by the message as Daniel was in 6 months. No member of the royal family had spoken directly to Daniel, and now a princess was summoning him to her private rooms. It was unprecedented, possibly scandalous, and almost certainly going to cause him trouble. Daniel read the message again, making sure he had understood it correctly. And then he looked up at the servant who was still waiting for his response. He took a deep breath and said the only thing he could say. "Al, the princess I will be honored to attend." The servant hurried away, and Daniel stood alone in the corridor, his mind racing with questions he could not answer. What could a princess possibly want from him? Why would she risk her reputation by meeting with a human in private? And what was he supposed to do now? He had no answers, only a growing sense that his quiet, lonely life on Valoria was about to change in ways he could not predict. He walked into his quarters and closed the door behind him, already dreading and anticipating the meeting in equal measure. The hour of the third moon was approaching fast, and Daniel Harris had a princess to meet. Daniel stood in Ambassador Bennett's office, watching her pace back and forth across the polished floor with increasing worry on her face. She had not taken the news well. Summons from a princess, she repeated for the third time, her voice tight with stress. Do you understand how dangerous this could be? Daniel understood perfectly, but he also understood that refusing a royal summons would be even more dangerous. Bennett stopped pacing and looked at him with exhausted eyes that had seen too many diplomatic crises in the past 6 months. Fine, she said at last. You have to go. But Daniel, please be careful. One wrong word could destroy everything we have worked for. Daniel promised to be careful, though he had no idea what careful even meant in a situation like this. He left the ambassador's office and made his way through the palace toward the royal wing, passing through checkpoints where guards examined him with cold suspicion. Each set of guards seemed more hostile than the last, their tall bodies blocking the corridor as they scanned his identification and searched him for weapons. He carried nothing but his worn paperback book, tucked into his jacket out of habit, and the guards found nothing threatening about a human with a book. They let him pass. Though their eyes followed him with obvious distrust, the royal wing was grander than anything Daniel had seen before. The walls covered in murals that depicted Valorian history stretching back thousands of years. He saw images of ancient wars and great discoveries, of emperors rising and falling, of a civilization so old that humanity's entire existence was barely a footnote in their story. He felt smaller with every step. A voice stopped him just before he reached the princess's door. Human Daniel turned and found himself face to face with Prince Kalen Velshan, the eldest son of the emperor and heir to the Valorian throne. The prince was tall even by Valorian standards, his silver hair flowing past his shoulders and his pale eyes burning with cold anger. "I know my sister has summoned you," Kalen said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I do not know why she would lower herself to speak with something like you. But I want to make one thing very clear." Daniel stood perfectly still, knowing that any wrong move could end badly. "Whatever she wants from you," the prince continued, "remember your place. You are temporary. Your entire species is temporary. We were ancient when your ancestors were crawling in the mud, and we will still be here long after your kind has turned to dust." Daniel wanted to respond, wanted to defend himself and his species. But he knew better than to argue with a prince who clearly hated him. Simply nodded and said nothing. Kalan stared at him for a long moment, perhaps hoping for a reaction that would give him an excuse to act. When Daniel remained silent, the prince made a sound of disgust and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridor. Daniel waited until the prince was gone, then took a deep breath and knocked on the princess's door. A soft voice called for him to enter. The door opened onto a room unlike anything Daniel had expected. Instead of the cold formality of the rest of the palace, Princess Alindra's chambers were warm and cluttered, filled with star maps and ancient texts and strange artifacts from worlds Daniel had never heard of. The princess herself stood by a window that looked out on the garden where Daniel read his books every night. And when she turned to face him, he saw something in her eyes that surprised him. She looked nervous. "Thank you for coming," she said, and her voice was softer than he had expected. "Please, sit down. I have something important to ask you." Daniel sat in a chair that was slightly too large for him, his feet barely touching the floor, and watched as the princess dismissed her attendants with a wave of her hand. The servants exchanged shocked glances, but obeyed, leaving Daniel alone with a member of the royal family in a way that was clearly against every rule of Valorian protocol. Alindra sat across from him and studied, his face with ancient eyes that had seen things he could not imagine. "I have been watching you," she said, and Daniel felt his heart skip at her words. "Every night in the garden, I have been listening to you read." Daniel did not know what to say, embarrassment and confusion flooding through him in equal measure. "I was not trying to spy," Alindra continued quickly. "I simply heard your voice one night, and I could not stop myself from returning. You speak of things that I have never heard before, things that do not exist in Valorian language or thought." She stood and walked to a shelf on the far wall, reaching up to retrieve something wrapped in pale silk. When she returned to her seat, she unwrapped the silk to reveal a small book, its cover faded and its pages worn with age. "This was found in a crashed human vessel," she explained, "over 300 years ago, long before your species made contact with the galaxy. My grandmother kept it as a curiosity, and when she died it passed to me." Daniel leaned forward and recognized the book immediately. It was a children's picture book, the kind that parents on Earth read to their children at bedtime, filled with simple drawings and simple words meant to teach young minds about the world. "I have studied this book for decades," Alindra said, and her voice carried a weight that surprised Daniel. "I have translated every word, analyzed every image, consulted scholars from a dozen different species. But there is one word I cannot understand." one concept that has no equivalent in any language. I know she opened the book to a page near the middle and pointed to a single word, printed beneath a drawing of a small child looking up at the stars. Hope. Daniel looked at the word and then looked at the princess. Beginning to understand why she had summoned him, I know what the word means in a technical sense. Alindra said, I know it refers to a belief in positive outcomes. But that is not enough. I can see in your stories and your poems that this word carries a weight far beyond its simple definition. And I need you to help me understand. She leaned forward, and Daniel saw something desperate in her ancient eyes. What does it mean to hope? She asked. And why would your species build an entire civilization around something so irrational? Daniel sat back in his chair and felt the weight of her question pressing down on him. This was not a simple vocabulary lesson. This was not something he could explain with definitions and examples. She was asking him to explain the core of what it meant to be human, the fundamental force that had driven his species from caves to stars. He looked at the princess, at her curious eyes and her nervous hands and her obvious hunger for an answer, and he realized that this moment mattered more than anything he had done in his 6 months on Valoria. Took a deep breath and began to speak. Hope, he said slowly, is believing that tomorrow can be better than today, even when there is no evidence to support that belief. Alindra frowned, confusion written across her elegant features. But why would anyone believe something without evidence? She asked. That is not logical. That is not rational. That is simply foolish. Daniel smiled sadly and shook his head. That is exactly the point. He said, hope is not logical. Hope is not rational. Hope is choosing to believe anyway. And as the night deepened around them, Daniel Harris began to teach an alien princess the most human lesson of all. Daniel tried to explain hope the way he would explain it to a student back on Earth, with logic and definitions and careful reasoning. It did not work. Every time he thought he was making progress, Alindra would ask another question that revealed just how deep the gap between their species truly was. If hope is belief without evidence, she said, then how is it different from delusion? Daniel paused, searching for words that could bridge a gulf of thousands of years and millions of light years. He realized that logic would not work here, that definitions would not work here, that the only thing that might work was a story. Let me tell you about my grandmother, he said. Alindra tilted her head, curious despite her confusion. Daniel's grandmother had died before he was born, but he had grown up hearing stories about her. Stories that had shaped who he became. She lived on Earth. He began in a small city near the ocean, and when she was young, there was a terrible disaster. A storm unlike anything anyone had seen before. It destroyed her home, killed her parents and her siblings, and left her alone in a world that had taken everything from her. Alindra listened with the focused attention of someone who had spent centuries learning to absorb information. She was 17 years old. Daniel continued, with no family, no home, no money, and no reason to believe that her life would ever be anything but pain and loss. What did she do? Alindra asked. Daniel smiled softly at the memory of stories he had heard 100 times. She rebuilt. He said, she found work cleaning houses and saved every coin she could. She went to school at night and taught herself to read and write. She met my grandfather and fell in love and had 3 children. And she died at 92 years old, surrounded by a family that loved her. But why? Alindra pressed, leaning forward with intensity in her ancient eyes. Every logical calculation would have told her that recovery was impossible, that the probability of success was too low to justify the effort. Why did she not simply accept her fate as any rational being would? Because she hoped, Daniel said simply. Alindra shook her head in frustration. That is circular reasoning. She said, you are telling me she hoped because she hoped. I need to understand the mechanism, the cause, the reason behind this irrational choice. Daniel sat quietly for a moment, trying to find a way to make her understand. Finally, he spoke again. His voice softer now. Humans are fragile, he said. We live for less than a century, if we are lucky. We break easily. We get sick easily. We die easily. And the universe does not care about us. Alindra nodded. This much she knew. We know all of this. Daniel continued. We know that we are small and brief and powerless against the vastness of space and time. We know that the odds are always against us, that the universe is indifferent at best and hostile at worst. Then why do you persist? Alindra asked. Because hope is our rebellion, Daniel said. And something in his voice made Alindra go still. Hope is how we fight back against a universe that wants us to give up. It is not rational. It is not logical. It is an act of defiance. It is looking at impossible odds and saying that we will try anyway. He leaned forward, holding her gaze with an intensity that surprised them both. My grandmother did not hope because she calculated the probability of success, he said. She hoped because the alternative was surrender. And humans do not surrender. Not to storms, not to loss. Not to the cold equations of probability that say we should just lie down and die. Alindra was silent for a long time, processing his words with a mind that had spent 2 centuries learning to think in certainties. Then she spoke, and her voice was barely above a whisper. We do not have this, she said. My people, the Valorians, we have certainty and probability and acceptance. We calculate outcomes and adjust our behavior accordingly. But we do not have hope. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stars with eyes that suddenly seemed older and sadder than before. Daniel waited, sensing that she was about to tell him something important. The Valorian Empire is dying, Alindra said, and the words hung in the air like a death sentence. Our birth rates have been declining for 5,000 years. Our scientists have calculated that within 10,000 years we will be extinct. And everyone knows this. Everyone accepts this. It is simply a fact of our existence. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. You have accepted your own extinction, he said. Slowly Alindra turned back to face him, and he saw something in her eyes that might have been the first stirring of an emotion her people had forgotten. We calculated the probability and found it to be a certainty, she said. And once something is certain, there is no point in fighting it. That is what we have always believed. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the ancient sorrow carved into her features. But you humans, she said, you look at certainty and you refuse to accept it. You fight against impossible odds. You believe in futures that cannot exist. And somehow, impossibly, you survive. She knelt beside his chair, bringing her eyes level with his, a gesture that would have shocked every noble in the palace. Can hope be taught? She asked, and her voice trembled with something that Daniel recognized, even if she did not. Can you teach my people to hope? Daniel looked at this ancient princess, this daughter of a dying empire, this being who had lived for 2 centuries without ever knowing what it felt like to believe in the impossible. He wanted to say yes, wanted to promise her that he could save her people with nothing but human optimism and stubbornness. But the truth was that he did not know. I do not know if hope can be taught, he said honestly. I only know that it can be shared. Alindra nodded slowly, accepting his uncertainty in a way that felt like progress. Then share it with me, she said. Tell me more stories. Help me understand what it feels like to believe in tomorrow. Daniel agreed, and they talked through the rest of the night, unaware that their conversation was about to cause a crisis that would shake the foundations of the Valorian Empire. Prince Kalen had spies everywhere, and one of those spies had heard every word spoken in his sister's chambers. By morning, the prince was standing before the emperor, his face twisted with righteous anger. The human is corrupting her, Kalen declared, filling her head with dangerous ideas, irrational concepts that could destabilize our entire society. The emperor listened in silence, his ancient face revealing nothing. I demand that the human be expelled from Valoria immediately. Kalen continued. Before his poison spreads any further, the Emperor considered his son's words for a long moment. Then, he gave an order that would change everything. Bring me the human, he said. I want to hear these dangerous ideas for myself. Daniel was confined to his quarters by order of Prince. Kalen, before the Emperor's summons could be delivered, guards stood outside his door day and night, their faces blank and their weapons ready. And Daniel was left alone with nothing but his thoughts and his worn paperback book. Ambassador Bennett fought hard to reach him, demanding to speak with the Emperor, invoking diplomatic protocols that the Valorians ignored with polite indifference. The human has committed no crime, Bennett argued to anyone who would listen. He simply answered questions asked by a member of the royal family, but her protests fell on deaf ears. And Daniel remained locked in his small room, waiting for a judgment he could not predict. 3 days passed in silence. On the 4th day, Daniel received a visitor he did not expect. The door opened, and a Valorian woman entered. Ancient beyond measure, her skin pale as moonlight, and her eyes holding the weight of millennia, she moved slowly, supported by a cane carved from black crystal. And Daniel recognized her immediately from the murals in the palace halls. This was Grandmother Matriarch Selvora, the oldest living Valorian, advisor to 5 generations of emperors. A being who had been alive when humans were still hunting with spears. Daniel stood quickly, unsure of the proper protocol for receiving such an important guest. She waved him back to his seat with a thin hand and lowered herself into the chair across from him. I have heard interesting things about you, she said, and her voice was like dry leaves rustling in an autumn wind. My great-granddaughter speaks of nothing else. Daniel did not know what to say, so he waited. Selvara studied him with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. You told her about hope, she said. Explain it to me. Daniel hesitated, remembering how badly his explanations had gone with Alindra. At first, hope is difficult to explain, he said carefully. I have 2,000 years of patience, Selvora replied. I can wait. So Daniel began again, just as he had with Alindra, telling stories instead of offering definitions. He told Selvora about human history, about the countless times his species had faced extinction and refused to accept death. Told her about ice ages survived by stubborn determination, about plagues overcome through desperate cooperation, about wars that should have destroyed humanity but instead made them stronger. He told her about parents who worked their entire lives for children who never thanked them, about scientists who cured diseases they would never suffer from, about strangers who died saving other strangers they would never meet. Selvora listened without interrupting, her ancient face impossible to read. When Daniel finally stopped talking, the silence stretched between them for a long moment. I remember when we stopped telling stories, Selvora said at last, and her voice carried a sadness that made Daniel's heart ache. It was after the scientists announced their calculations about our extinction. Once we knew for certain that we would die, there seemed no point in creating anything new. She looked at Daniel with something that might have been curiosity or might have been grief. We stopped writing songs when we calculated that no one would be alive to hear them in 10,000 years. She continued, we stopped building monuments when we realized they would outlast our entire species. We stopped having children when we accepted that bringing new life into a dying civilization was cruel. Daniel listened in silence, beginning to understand the true depth of what had happened to the Valorian people. We became efficient, Selvora said. We stopped wasting energy on foolish things like art and music and stories. We focused only on managing our decline as gracefully as possible. She leaned forward, and Daniel saw something stirring in her ancient eyes. But you humans, she said, you know you will die. Every single one of you knows with absolute certainty that your life will end. And yet you keep creating, you keep building. You keep telling stories that you know will outlive you, because the stories are not for us. Daniel said softly. They are for the ones who come after. Salvora went very still. We stopped thinking about the ones who come after. She whispered, when we accepted that eventually there would be no one left to come after. She rose slowly from her chair. Leaning heavily on her cane, I understand now why my great-granddaughter is so fascinated by you, she said. You have shown her something we forgot existed. She walked to the door, then paused and looked back at Daniel. The Emperor will hear you tomorrow, she said. My grandson Kalen wants you expelled from Valoria forever. But I have convinced the Emperor to let you speak first. She opened the door, and the guards snapped to attention. Tell him what you told me, Salvora said. Tell him about the power of foolish stories and impossible beliefs. Tell him why your species keeps fighting, even when they know they will lose. What if he does not understand? Daniel asked. Then at least you will have tried, Salvora replied, and she smiled. A small sad smile that transformed her ancient face. Is that not what hope means? She left, and Daniel was alone again with his thoughts racing. Tomorrow he would stand before the Emperor of Valoria, one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and try to explain something that could not be explained. He should have been terrified. And part of him was but another part of him. The part that had kept humans going through ice ages and plagues and wars and every disaster the universe had thrown at them. That part felt something different. That part felt hope. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat by his window and watched the stars wheel overhead, thinking about his grandmother and her impossible survival, thinking about all the humans throughout history who had faced impossible odds and refused to give up. He thought about Aelindra and her desperate questions, about Salvora and her sad memories, about an entire civilization that had surrendered to the certainty of its own destruction, and he made a decision. Tomorrow he would not just speak to the Emperor about hope. He would show him what hope looked like. He would stand before the most powerful being he had ever met and refuse to be afraid, refuse to be small, refused to accept that his species was too young and too primitive to matter. He would be exactly what humanity had always been, a small, fragile, impossibly stubborn species that looked at the darkness and chose to light a candle anyway. Daniel Harris smiled in the darkness of his room. Tomorrow would be the most important day of his life, and possibly the most important day in the history of human-Valorian relations. He had no idea if he would succeed, but he was going to try anyway. That was what hope meant. The throne room of the Valorian Emperor was the largest enclosed space Daniel had ever seen it, stretched for hundreds of feet in every direction, its ceiling lost in shadows far above, its walls lined with the faces of every emperor who had ruled for the past 50,000 years. Daniel walked through the center of that vast hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and he felt the weight of uncountable eyes watching him. The entire Valorian High Court had assembled for this moment. Nobles and advisors and military commanders filled the galleries on either side, their tall, elegant forms draped in ceremonial robes, their pale faces turned toward the small human who walked among them like an insect in a cathedral at the far end of the hall. Seated on a throne carved from a single massive crystal sat the Emperor himself. He was ancient even by Valorian standards, his skin almost translucent, his silver hair flowing past his shoulders like a waterfall frozen in time. He had ruled for 3,000 years, and his eyes held a weariness that made Daniel's heart ache. Behind the Emperor stood Prince Kalen, his handsome face twisted with barely concealed triumph. Beside Kalen stood Princess Aelindra, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes fixed on Daniel with something that might have been fear or might have been hope. Daniel stopped at the foot of the throne and bowed deeply. As Ambassador Bennett had taught him, the Emperor studied him in silence for a long moment. My son tells me you have been spreading dangerous ideas, the Emperor said at last, his voice filling the vast hall without effort. He says you have corrupted my daughter with irrational concepts that could destabilize our entire civilization. Daniel straightened and met the Emperor's ancient gaze eye. Answered her questions honestly. He said, "Nothing more." The Emperor leaned forward slightly. Curiosity flickering in his tired eyes, "She asked you about hope," he said, "a concept that has no equivalent in our language. So I will ask you the same question." She asked, "What is hope? And why should I care about the beliefs of a species that will be dead before my next birthday?" Daniel heard Kellen's soft laugh from somewhere behind the throne. He ignored it. "Hope," Daniel said, and his voice was steady despite his pounding heart, "is not a belief. It is a choice." The Emperor raised one silver eyebrow, explained Daniel, took a deep breath, and spoke the words he had been preparing all. "Not your scientists calculated that your species will be extinct in 10,000 years, he said. And you accepted that calculation as truth. You stopped creating, stopped building, stopped dreaming, because you believed there was no point in fighting something certain." He paused, letting his words echo in the vast silence. "But certainty is not truth," he continued. "Certainty is just the end of possibility. The moment you stopped hoping, you started dying." Murmurs rippled through the assembled court, shock and outrage mingling in equal measure. "How dare you?" Kalen snarled, stepping forward with his hand on his weapon. "You come to our world, eat our food, breathe our air, and then insult us with your primitive philosophy." The Emperor raised a hand, and Kalen fell silent instantly. "Let him finish," the Emperor said, his eyes never leaving Daniel. Daniel nodded his thanks and continued. "Humans live for less than a century," he said. "We are fragile. We are weak. We die easily and often by every rational calculation. We should have gone extinct 100 times over." He spread his hands, taking in the vast throne room and everyone in it. "But we are still here," he said. "We survived ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters that should have wiped us out. And we did not survive because we were stronger or smarter than our problems." He met the Emperor's gaze with a conviction that surprised even himself. "We survived because we refused to accept that survival was impossible," he said. "We looked at certain doom and we chose to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find another way." The throne room was utterly silent now, every Valorian frozen in place, watching the small humans speak words that challenged everything they had believed for 5,000 years. "Hope is not about probability," Daniel said. "It is about possibility. As long as there is even the smallest chance that tomorrow could be different from today, hope says we should try to make it better." He pointed toward Princess Elindra, who watched him with tears streaming down her elegant face. "Your daughter asked me if hope can be taught," he said, "and I told her I did not know. But I think I understand now." He turned back to the Emperor, and something in his voice made the ancient ruler lean forward. "Hope cannot be taught like a lesson in the classroom," Daniel said, "but it can be shared like a fire passed from torch to torch. One person believes, and their belief gives others permission to believe too." He squared his shoulders and spoke his final words directly to the Emperor. "Your people are not dying because extinction is certain," he said. "You are dying because you have stopped fighting for life. You have calculated your end and accepted it. But calculation is not destiny. Certainty is not fate." He held the Emperor's gaze with all the stubborn defiance of a species that had looked at every catastrophe in history and said, "Not today. You want to know what hope is," he said. "Hope is choosing to plant a tree whose shade you will never sit in. Hope is building a civilization for children you will never meet. Hope is looking at 10,000 years of calculated doom and saying that you will try anyway." The silence stretched for an eternity. Then the Emperor did something that shocked every Valorian in the room. He laughed. It was a soft sound, rusty with disuse, but unmistakably a laugh. "You are either very brave or very foolish," the Emperor said. "Perhaps both." He rose from his throne, towering over Daniel, and looked down at the human with something new in his ancient eyes. "I have ruled for 3,000 years," he said, "and in all that time, no one has ever spoken to me the way you just did. Not my advisors, not my children, not even my mother when she was alive." He stepped down from his throne, closer to Daniel than any emperor had ever stood to an alieni. "Want you to stay," he said, "not as a diplomat, not as an attach, but as a teacher. I want you to teach my people what you have taught my daughter and my grandmother." Callan made a sound of protest, but the emperor silenced him with a look. "We have been certain for too long," the emperor said. "Perhaps it is time to be foolish." Grandmother matriarch Selvora emerged from the shadows behind the throne, her ancient face wearing the same small smile she had shown Daniel the night before. "We have been wise for 10,000 years," she said, "and our wisdom has brought us nothing but a slow march toward extinction. Perhaps the humans can show us a different path." Daniel looked around the vast throne room, at the shocked faces of the Valorian nobles, at the hopeful tears on Alendra's cheeks, at the grudging respect in even Callan's eyes. He had come to Valoria as a nobody, a minor attach in a diplomatic mission that no one expected to succeed. Now he stood before the most powerful beings in the sector, and they were asking him to teach them how to hope. It was impossible. It was irrational. It was exactly the kind of foolish optimism that humans had always been known for. Daniel smiled. "I would be honored," he said. 1 year later, Daniel sat in the palace gardens reading aloud, just as he had done every night since his arrival. But he was no longer alone. Alindra sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, and around them sat a growing circle of young Valorians who had come to hear the human stories. They were learning to tell their own stories now, tales of possibility instead of certainty, songs about tomorrows that might never come but were worth singing about anyway. As Daniel closed his book, Alindra asked the question she always asked: "What happens next in the story?" Daniel looked at her, at the hope shining in her ancient eyes, and smiled. "I do not know," he said. "That is the point far across the sector. In the offices of the Valorian Science Ministry, researchers were puzzling over data that made no sense for the first time in 3,000 years. The birth rate had increased. No one could explain it scientifically. No one could calculate how it had happened. The numbers simply did not add up, but Daniel Harris knew the answer for the first time in millennia. The Valorians had a reason to bring children into the world. They had learned to hope, and that made all the difference.